What an honor to be able to be here with a lot of my friends, and thanks Daniel and Pastor Kerwin, and wow, what an honor to be able to be among a lot of heroes that I have had the pleasure of working with. It's great to be with Michael and Ron and others. It's great to be with my APU students who are cheering in the front row. That's right. I told them to do a wave, if they can. But as we heard about homelessness on the screen, as well as throughout all of today, this is a day that is it's an exciting time. It's exciting at one point because there's always hope in the midst of difficulty, and as was spoken, through suffering usually brings something good. And so this is an exciting time in the midst of difficulty. I was reading a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin in her book No Ordinary Time. And the author quotes Eleanor Roosevelt at the 1940 Democratic Convention. It was a difficult time in our country. They were deciding whether or not they wanted to enter World War II or remain in isolation. They were deciding whether or not FDR should get a third term, the very first time that would ever be done in our history. And so there was tension throughout our country. And FDR asked her, the first woman to be able to speak to a Democratic political convention. And she responded, and as she got up to the microphone, her word says, "This is no ordinary time. It's no time for weighing anything except what we can best do for our country as a whole." Let me say it again. This is no ordinary time. No time for weighing anything except for what we can best do for our country as a whole. And that's our focus this weekend, is that this is no ordinary time. This is a unique time in our society, because this is the time when the church is really being called into question. We find this paradox in life, and there's a quote or a couple different studies from the Gallup study in 2008 that showed that religious people among us are the most individuals who are out doing something for others. That's good news, amen? At the same time, a couple years later, a Barna poll said that 59% of teens that were involved in the church are leaving the church. And so if you put those two together, you end up realizing that we're working hard. We're working hard, but in some ways, we're not impacting our society like we should. And with that, we end up losing the ability to be able to impact society for God's kingdom. And so we're working hard, but we're then disconnected from society quite often. And so, again, God's work in the world. Today, we're going to talk about homelessness, but hopefully look at some specific principles that are beyond just the issue of homelessness. Homelessness touches all of our hearts because we think, as Dr. Walsh talked this morning about healthcare, that homelessness is that thing that breaks our heart to figure out how frustrating to think that an individual would live on the street day after day, year after year. And we want to look at how we can connect really the aspects of God's kingdom to be relevant in our world. Our impact of our witness is in question. Gandhi says, "I like your Christ, but I really don't like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." And I know I'm speaking to the choir because you are the Christians that are being the witness of God's kingdom for the world. But we need to be able to connect with a society that is looking for an example. Some wants to move away into isolation. We want to move away and say, I don't even want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to deal with the homeless. I've dealt with them time and time again. When I live downtown, you pass them. And at the time when we think, let's just isolate and not deal with the situation, I hear the wonderful wisdom of Frodo and Gandalf. Any Lord of the Rings fans? That Frodo says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish that none of this would ever happen." And Gandalf says, "So do all who see such times." But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And so as we're here this weekend, this is a time to be able to say, this is an exciting, hopeful time to be able to gather the resources of God's kingdom so that we can be used to impact our world. As we look at peace and justice, we do remember that our witness always comes before your proclamation. I'm going to say it again. Your witness will always come before your proclamation on issues of justice. Which means, do you walk the walk and not just talk the talk? Because the reputation of the world upon the church is that we just talk the talk. Now, not necessarily here, but how do we then proclaim and connect with the world that is hurting? And so John Stott says that sometimes there is hypocrisy in our philanthropy. So that when we walk the walk, we really are following through with what Jesus told us to do. And that we're not just talking the talk. And so, how does that impact society? You probably all got your examples, but I attend Christian Assembly Church on Sunday morning, and they have a group called Kids Hope. And a couple weeks ago, they were talking about their Kids Hope program. It's a national program that empowers churches to form a partnership with local elementary schools. And their administrator, who's not a believer, said to the individuals from Christian Assembly, I don't believe in God, but if I did, I would go to that type of church. There is something different about those people, mentors, who show up faithfully at our school each week to love the most unlovable kids. Isn't that good news? You probably have those examples as well, as examples where individuals say, you know, I don't really believe in Jesus, but if I did, it's because of your actions. It's because of your love. And so St. Francis of Assisi says that preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. So tonight we want to look at what are some paradigm shifts of how do we deal with homeless individuals so that we can be the church. Bishop Desmond Tutu says that the church must be the prophetic voice which cries out, thus saith the Lord, speaking up against injustice and violence and against oppression and exploitation, against all that dehumanizes God's children and makes them less of what God wants them to be. Before we look at these paradigm shifts, I want us to kind of have an overarching umbrella, and the umbrella is love. Would you say love with me? Love. In Luke chapter 10, we know the Good Samaritan story. The Good Samaritan story we all know. But it's interesting, a lot of times, do you know that, the question before that was a question of love. It's a question of how do we love our neighbor. And so we can talk about paradigm shifts, we can talk about workshops and programs, but if there's not a deep, deep love for humanity, then it's all in vain. In downtown Los Angeles, I planted a church along with my wife and family and others, as part of other ministries. And as we planted Central City Community Church, we wanted to be able to have an outreach. And we started karaoke. Any of you karaoke fans out there? I'm not going to have you come up here, you can sing. And at karaoke, it was always a place where we interacted with the most unlovable individuals. And so different times, there's different pictures in my mind of people that were at karaoke that describes the fact, does God even love them? Does God even love Michelle, who walked in to the service, or the karaoke ministry? And she realized as I began to talk with her that she was the first transgender individual that I had ever met. And I sat down and talked with Michelle or Michael about her own struggle growing up and her identity issues. And she said, I was worried that you wouldn't let me come in here. Does God love Michelle? Does God love Bill, who is a Vietnam vet, and I remember him wheeling himself in and had legs amputated, and he wheeled up and sang this incredible song. And if you looked at Bill, it wouldn't be very lovable because he smelled and he was on the streets for years. But when he started singing, he sang Daniel from Elton John, and he just rocked the house, and everybody gave him a standing ovation. And I can't help but think, does God love even Bill? Does God love Neil, who sings the New York song of I Did It My Way, but he had no tone at all, And he would sing every week, and this is hilarious, every week he'd sing the same song over and over again. And he'd do it monotone, kind of like, I did it my way, something like that, really bad, And I'm thinking, does God even love Neil, Does God even love somebody who can sing that bad? Well, yeah. I hope so, And the good news is that God has a deep sense of love for humanity. And that's got to be the core of everything that we talk about. Henry Nouwen says, service is then an expression of our search for God. It's not just the desire to bring about individual or social change. So radical servanthood challenges us while attempting persistently to overcome poverty, hunger, illness, and any form of human misery. It's to reveal the gentle presence of our compassionate God in the midst of a broken world. And you do that every day, don't you? Is that you struggle with individuals and you try to figure out how to reveal the compassionate presence of God in our broken world. And so the core value of love needs to be the umbrella over anything else. And so I want to kind of jump to how effective churches are dealing with homeless situations. Now, as I talk about 3 paradigm shifts, I want you to know that I'm not talking about all effective churches in Christendom. I'm not going to talk about worship, and I'm not going to talk about evangelism, but dealing with peace and justice issues in the homeless. The effective churches are doing these three things. And I want you to join with me as we look at these three things as part of God's kingdom. The first is to collaborate. Would you say collaborate with me? Is that we have through CEOs. We've got to collaborate, empower, and organize. But we're going to look at collaborate first. And I want you to turn to somebody next and collaborate. I want you, if you got somebody close to you, shake their hand. Turn and shake their hand. Collaborate means that we are gathering together, that we recognize God's sovereignty in the world, and that we are gathering together and connecting with all of humanity in order to live out the values of God's kingdom, dealing with the things that break God's heart. Now, we can go into the whole Old Testament. We could talk about how God used Egyptian kings to be able to deal with issues of the famine. We can talk about how God used Artaxerxes to be able to address rebuilding of a wall for Nehemiah. We can talk about Babylon. We can talk about the New Testament, about how God, in Romans 13, says that God uses government to be able to administer good. It all comes down to really the fact that God, if we really believe that God is a sovereign God, then we don't need to isolate. And so collaboration and isolation are the two opposites and paradoxes in dealing with homeless services. And in 20 plus years of dealing with homeless ministry, churches after churches, the one thing that we need to do to be, when I look at effective churches, are churches that are collaborating. They're not just staying isolated onto their own, doing their own little thing. They are collaborating because they believe that the heart of God is compelling them to do so. We talked about the winter shelter program that's here. And the winter shelter program, there's a couple different ones in the San Gabriel Valley. And I deal with the county of Los Angeles and the San Gabriel Valley. And so in San Gabriel Valley, there's two different winter shelter programs, primarily. There's one in Pomona on the east coast, on the east side of San Gabriel Valley. But in the middle of the San Gabriel Valley, the East San Gabriel Valley Coalition to End Hunger and Homelessness does a rotating church shelter. There's also the Pasadena Bad Weather Program, and thank you for, if you want to buy a t-shirt, see them out in the front, they're raising money. Thanks Rebecca and Patricia O'Neill for that program. But in the East San Gabriel Valley Coalition, it's a rotating church. And you know why they have a rotating church shelter? Because the cities won't give them a zoning allowance for shelters. And so for close to 20 years, rotating churches have done shelter every night. And they're Methodist churches and Presbyterian churches. And it really began out of St. Vianney Catholic Church. And so Catholic Church, Methodist, Presbyterian, there's a lot of different churches that gather together to be able to, during the winter time, they rotate for 3 weeks at a time individuals and families that need housing for shelter. Well, this year, the funding was decreased, and so the East San Gabriel Valley Coalition didn't have enough money to house families in hotels with vouchers. And so what ended up happening, they didn't want to just leave the families on the street, so they began to put the word out. Can anybody help us? It's amazing, but the one who stepped up to the plate was the Tzu Chi Foundation. Tzu Chi is a Buddhist group that on a moment's notice will drop everything and go to disaster relief around the world. They're the most sacrificial, loving, compassionate people, in some sense, some of the most compassionate people I've ever met in my life. And they stepped up to the plate and they said, we'll donate the money to be able to respond and to house families in the winter shelter program. Now, some people, as Christians, would say, well, you can't, that's compromising. I think from God's perspective, I think God's heart was pretty pleased with that. I think that if we really believe in a sovereign God, then God uses every aspect underneath his umbrella to be able to help to love people and to be able to house people who are homeless. And so I joined them in celebrating Tzu Chi Foundation in that collaboration. And so the question is can we not compromise our own mission and vision, but yet still believe biblically, like the Good Samaritan, that he not only dealt with the individual who was hurt, but he also dealt with the innkeeper. And that he used someone else. He didn't isolate the situation. He ended up connecting with others. And so collaboration ends up being an example of an effective church. So I believe that God's heart was pleased with this collaboration for the sake of a loving humanity during this unordinary time. The second thing of an effective church is that effective churches empower those that they work with. Would you say empower with me? One more time. I want you to turn down next to somebody. I want you to push, hold your hands out like this, and push up or down on the person that's next to you. Okay? There's pressure against each other, right? Okay, you can let go now. The good thing about empowering is that God's people, effective churches, empower and don't patronize individuals that they're serving. They end up having a respect for each other's tensions, whatever they bring to the table, that there's a sense of gifts and strengths, that there's an incredible gift and spiritual gift, but there's strength that individual has. I think it's up there, is ABC. We talked with Michael about ABC is an asset-based community development. And so when you go into a community, you don't look at the deficiencies, you look at their strengths. Wow, what a concept. That there's individuals that have strengths and you can connect with them. And so are our ministries, are our programs dealing with the homeless empowering? Do they really lift them up? Do they acknowledge the aspect of who that individual is? Is there dignity that occurs? Dr. Martin Luther King, Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert in When Helping Hurt says, one of the biggest mistakes that North American churches make by far is applying relief in situations in which rehabilitation or development is the appropriate intervention. And so focusing only on relief and staying only at giving sack lunches is not empowering. We need to not only continue to do that to build a relationship, but then to continue to do more to say, what is the gifts of that individual to help them to get housed? It's more dignifying for us to be able to help them to find housing. I'm going to jump through the next quote there. It's a big, long quote. But mainly it's the fact that there's enough need around there. A lot of times in empowering, churches will say, you know, I'm not going to deal with it because it's government's involved. If government will just get out of it, then the church will step up to it. In reality, that's an old school discussion because in reality, there's enough need to go around. And that's a whole discussion that happened, and we can go into the history of it decades ago. But the reality is that is your ministry, is your program an empowering one? Are you trying to find ways to lift up people? As Bill Wong showed on the video, the best practices today, as we talked in our workshop, is not just sheltering individuals, but also sheltering and providing permanent supportive housing. And what that means is if you got a family that's homeless, instead of sending them downtown to Union Rescue Mission, where I directed their family program, and then sending them out to Hope Gardens, which is out in another part of the community, you house them in your community of origin. And so what an opportunity. If a church has property or an apartment that you can put them in, they stay in their community of origin. It's a lot more dignifying and empowering instead of sending them through the cycle and continuum of care. And so there's new best practices that are a lot more empowering. And so we would love to be able to talk with you and to work with you as we talk about the Activate session tomorrow about ways to empower the homeless that you're working with. Let me go to the third one of organize. That not only churches not only collaborate and empower, but they also organize. Would you say organize with me? Organize. Last thing, turn to the next person and grab their wrist like this and pull real hard. Don't pull them off onto the floor or anything like that. So, all right, there you go. All right, now you can let go. Effective churches organize for the sake of really confronting the systems that oppress. Dr. Martin Luther King said, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Nobody really gives up. If they're in a place of oppression, they're not going to give up that situation. Historically, we know that gathering people can change the world. Whether it was the American Revolution, or women's right to vote, or dignity for farm workers to civil rights. But what is about our future has to do with organizing. Can you dream a little bit about what it would be like if all the churches got together and began to respond and organize to respond to homelessness? What an exciting thought. When I started Hope Gardens with Union Rescue Mission out in the valley, we had angry neighbors that were organizing against us. And we began to gather people together to respond to that. A couple weeks ago, I was at a city council meeting, remain nameless because I don't want to hurt that city's reputation. But I was at a city council meeting, and they were fighting the issue of developmentally disabled individuals being housed in their community. And I thought, oh, that'll be an easy thing. But you know what? The whole city council was filled with people fighting developmentally disabled people from housing in their community. They didn't want them in their community. 2 weeks later, though, the good news is, 2 weeks later, I was at the County Board of Supervisors meeting, and we were advocating for a veterans homeless program in El Monte. I will name that one. El Monte has stepped up to the plate to have a veterans homeless program. And they brought about 20 veterans there, and one of the Board of Supervisors said, I was going to vote against this, but because of those 20 veterans that are sitting here, I'm going to vote for it. That's organizing. That's gathering people together to be able to help to change systems and policies that oppress. Dr. King again said in his Break the Silence, there's a quote by Cesar Chavez that's on there as well. Cesar Chavez says, from the depths of need and despair, people can work together and they can organize themselves to solve their own problems and fill their own needs with dignity and strength. And so when we organize together, there's so many different things we can do. Dr. King says, on 1 year before his assassination, our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and to go out into sometimes a hostile world declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and materialism. Can you dream for a little bit? Isaiah 65 talks about what it would be like. Churches using their facilities to house people collaboratively so that the winter shelter could become a year-round shelter. Maybe your church wants to do that, wants to be involved in that. Maybe housing projects could be involved in your church or on your church property, where you're beginning to develop something for God's kingdom on your property. Maybe you're collaborating with another group of individuals. So you can't do it all on your own, but you're collaborating with others and you're stepping into what they're doing to be able to help to change society. Maybe your food pantries can begin to collaborate with social services so it becomes a continuum towards housing placement. Through your collaboration, through your empowering, through your organizing, we can help to change the world. Hope Gardens, as I said before, was a transitional housing for homeless families. And it's interesting, the good news is that after those people were fighting against us, and I even had a guy stick his finger in my chest and say, if your homeless families come into my neighborhood, I'm going to shoot them. Wow, okay. Man. I stepped back. But 1 year later, when we began to have families begin to be placed into housing, they came to the 1 year reunion, and all those people that were against us, they were for us. They began to have tears and say, well, if I would have known this is what it was about, I wouldn't have fought you so much. So do you know what? If you organize for God's kingdom, you can help to change a cold, hardened heart to something that's soft, that loves God. Let me just close with a story. Any Hunger Game fans out there? Yeah. See, I know there's a lot of you who don't want to even admit it, but it's all right. It's okay. I've got a 15-year-old daughter, so I know Hunger Games up and down. In Hunger Games, there's a symbol. And the symbol is 3 fingers like this. I want you to do this for me real quick. This is a sign. And you take this sign and you touch your lips and you hold it up there. It's a sign of respect. You can put it down now. It's a sign of respect for District 12. And District 12 is, again, there's an oppressive capital. And then the districts are the ones that are being oppressed. And the sign is not only respect for someone, but it's also the ultimate sign of rebellion. It's silence to the capital. It's silence to the oppressor. And when, in the movie, a profound time when Rue is killed, and Katniss takes Rue's body and puts flowers around it and treats that body with respect. And as she gives respect to the camera, all the districts see this and they start rioting. Because they know that it's not just a respect for her, but it's a respect for us as humanity to respond against oppression. Now, I'm not calling for riots, don't worry, we're not going to do that. But I am calling for people to stand up to do something great for God's kingdom. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it will be great. I love William Wallace in Braveheart, and he says, every man dies, but not every man really lives. The great news is that we can stand up and do something great for God's kingdom. We can collaborate together because we trust in God's sovereignty, that we can work with governments, we can work with non-believers, we can work with others, because God is using all of us to be able to minister justice in the world. He can use us He can help us to be empowered by Him, but also to empower others so that we treat people with respect we can also organize together. And so the question is, with the hurting and broken world, will you join me? Will you join me in living out that purpose, where we will collaborate together, we will empower, we will organize, and together we will have a revolution of love and compassion. And so will you join with me in standing for justice in this world in which we live? God bless you. Have a great day.